to another episode of Data Gurus. Today, I have Ben Hookway, who is CEO of Relevant Insights. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
Thank you for joining me. I know you were on holiday last week, so this is a nice way to come back into the business. And
I know, nice, gentle reintroduction to business.
yeah, and reflect a little bit about your journey. Before we get started about understanding about your company and what it does, which is quite fascinating, I thought we could just start with you just sharing a little bit about your journey to this point in time.
Sure. So, I've been in, I guess, technology all of my career. I started off, I'm based in the UK. I'm from Scotland originally. And quite early on in my career, I ended up having the chance to move out to the States. Initially for a 6-month posting, which then turned into 6 years through the .com bubble, which was a fantastic experience. So I spent 3 years in DC and then 3 years in San Francisco. And, all the cliches of the .com boom, which then came to an end, came back to the UK and then ended up founding a mobile phone software business, which we sort of bootstrapped while selling into South Korea, which is probably the topic of another podcast.
Yeah, that's enough. Yeah.
And then, I was founder and CEO of that and co-founder of that one, got some VC funding for that. And then we exited that business to Mentor Graphics, who are based in Portland, big company in chip design and EDA. And then I sort of ran business development for them in Asia. A lot of time in South Korea and Taiwan and China, places like that. And then what happens is when you get funding for a company from a VC and you exit, or in other words, when you get lucky once, they think you get lucky every time.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So after I had a pretty decent relationship with the venture capital company, and then after I was kind of sick of flying out to Asia all the time, I was doing some other things, and they said, well, you should go and have a look at this company we've invested in, which was this research and development project coming out of a university in the north of England. And it was fascinating technology. And I started consulting, and then time went by, became CEO, and that ended up transforming into Relative Insight.
Very fascinating. And it's amazing how many geographies you've covered throughout your career. That's again a topic for another podcast, but always fascinating to see how people jump around and travel, both for business and pleasure. Let's talk about when you first joined Relative Insights. The use case was very different than what it is today, and how you kind of made that pivot. But actually, before we do that, let's talk a little bit about exactly what the company does.
Yes.
And then we can talk about the use case.
Who are we and why am I talking?
Yeah. Exactly.
So Relative Insight is a text analytics technology SaaS platform. So our customers license our tech in order to analyze the unstructured text data that they have. And most companies have got an awful lot of this stuff. So examples of that could be review data, or it could be the open ends in surveys, or it could be social, or it could be news, and so on and so on. And almost all companies have this data floating around. And we provide a platform that allows them to drive business insights out of that data. So that's kind of at our core what we do. We license software and a bit of managed service to help customers do that. I guess why we do that? Most customers and most stakeholders use business intelligence sources, which are usually quant driven.
Right.
So because they're important, right? And so we use them ourselves in Relative Insight. So if you were to sort of ask an exec what their sort of top 10 sources of business intelligence are, usually they will say, quant numbers. So obviously like sales, gross margin, site traffic, things like this, NPS score, for example. And these are all great, but they are limited in that they tell you what is going on, But the promise of text and unstructured text is that that can tell you why things are happening. So, for example, your NPS score might be going up or going down, but the open-end response in the NPS survey will tell you why it's going up or it's going down. So that's why we're so excited about it. Um, Not so easy though, because why doesn't anyone do it? Well, there's lots of reasons about that, which we'll get into. But it's unstructured, it's messy, and traditionally the output of text analytics has been sort of quite vague. I mean, if anyone's listening to this right now, I'm sure word clouds are popping into their heads and they're kind of rolling their eyes, thinking, "Oh no, he's going to talk about word clouds." Well, I'm not. Don't worry. Um, but it's we what we do is like we get our customers past the vagueness of the output of that qualitative sort of word cloud type stuff, and we turn it fundamentally into metrics for our customers. We do this in three areas primarily. One is consumer analytics, market research type world. The second is customer experience analytics. So, how can you sort of analyze the language that you're using with your customers or that your customers are using with you in customer experience to improve that? And then the last is employee engagement, actually, is starting to come up. So, obviously, is talent's a really important part of business competition at the moment, and really understanding your employee, your workforce is really important. So we get used for that as well.
And there's a lot of software platforms that are collecting open-end responses and pulsing employees to get
Correct.
level of satisfaction and engagement. And I imagine your platform could host all that data, not host, can use that data to provide some context around it.
That is exactly right. So we are an analytic layer. So we focus not on getting more data. Like normally, our customers have got quite enough data. Thanks very much already. What we do is specialize in sort of multiplying by 10 the value they get out of the text data they are collecting anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's so funny. I find that we've gone from, wouldn't it be nice to have, to now having loads of data that's accessible, to saying, now how do I contextualize all this information? I'm getting sources from, call centers, sources from the chatbots that's on my website, survey data. So how do I contextualize all this unstructured, for lack of a better word, data, and infuse it into decision making? Um, and we're going to get to that. But so tell us a little bit about how relative insights, that early use case, because I as a parent I'm fascinated, but just in general the pivot from the initial use case to the commercial use case.
Okay. Okay. So originally, Relative Insight was a research project in conjunction with security services in the UK. So our job was to uncover people masquerading online. And in particular, we focused on child protection. So our job was to uncover whether this person really is a 13-year-old girl or if they're a 40-year-old man doing a very sophisticated impression of a 13-year-old girl. So this is a difficult problem at all kinds of levels. But from a data point of view, it's particularly tricky because the bad guys are really good at it. To the point where if you were to give suspect language to a standard text analytics algorithm, it would probably tell you it is a 13-year-old girl. Yeah. So because the bad guys are like 96% perfect. And so when you're that good, like you can fool systems. So what we had to come up with was a system which would kind of figure this out. And what we ended up coming up with is a principle which to this day underpins everything we do in relative insight. And that is what we call a comparative linguistic approach. So what we would do is that we would get databases of genuine 13-year-old girl, verified 13-year-old girl language from the security services. Then we get suspect language. And then what you actually want to do is compare them. And our output was the 4% difference in the language. And it was the differences actually would catch people. So what you say doesn't actually matter. What really matters are the differences between you and somebody contextually relevant to you. That's the stuff that really registers. So um, that's what the system does. It's quite a simple concept. It's incredibly powerful. So um, the we did do some good. The software was sort of bought by some security services and did was used in investigations, which led to sort of the breakup of some pedophile rings and things like that, which was fantastic. Um,
That's data
however,
for good, right? Yeah.
yeah, but it is quite tricky actually to make a living
Yes.
from these use cases, which is frustrating. But there you go. So in order to support that work at the time, we started looking at other applications of the same principles of language analytics, but in different areas. And we started looking at marketing and pretty quickly scored some great contracts and really interesting projects with people like Saatchi and Unilever and people like this. And the hard bit was actually learning the marketing world. Not the technology was easy compared with learning the new industry. But once we kind of crafted that, we ended up sort of really productizing what we had and turning the company into what it is now, where we have hundreds of customers, most of which actually is out of North America. We have people like Comcast, we have people like Nespresso, we have, Sony Music. We have really fantastic brands working with us.
So we talked about, the initial use case, but let's put some more context around a use case. And I think we've talked about beauty, and you did some research around um, looking at different data by age segment, and you've uncovered some, what people on a day to day basis might not even think about. But when you do the analysis, you really picked up some key
Yeah.
learnings there.
Yeah. So maybe I'll run through the cosmetics one, and then the other one is maybe I'll talk about some stuff with Diet Coke, which is quite a good illustration. So these were two, really early projects that we were involved with. So one of our customers was a cosmetics brand, and they're associated with a kind of older demographic, and they were trying to reach into a younger group, but their sort of content communication strategy didn't seem to be working. So what we did is that we got a whole bunch of reviews of cosmetics in North America, and what we did is that we split them by age, and we had thousands of reviews left by people in their 20s and thousands of reviews left by people in their 50s.
By the way, how did you know the age?
It was marked in the
Okay.
review. Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
So that was a metadata tag. We'll come back to metadata.
Okay.
Most most text data is aligned with some really interesting metadata with it. That's the key, actually. So we had these reviews. We had it. The metadata tag was age. So we had you know a million words of the average novel is like 120,000 words. We had like a few novels of 20 somethings and then 50 something. So what you want to do is actually compare them. And the system does then is it will look at, okay, what did 20 somethings talk about significantly more than 50-year-olds and vice versa? Because you don't want to know if you just do the analysis on its own, it will look quite similar. You really need to analyze what is statistically significantly different. And the kind of classic here was if you're in your 20s, you tended to say you use the word wear makeup. And if you're in your 50s, you tended to say apply makeup. Now, that sounds always trivial, but if you're trying to engage with a particular group, this stuff can be really important. And you go back to the customer and guess what? They were saying, apply our product every day for great results. So they were saying the wrong thing, but didn't even know they were saying the wrong thing. Because what comparison does is that it discovers critical insights. Whereas most analytic approaches tend to be very search based. So you have to think of the idea and then search for evidence of your idea. But nobody would ever have thought to search for where or search for a plot. So they ended up redoing their communication and and getting some good results out of doing that. Similarly, people who own a DSLR camera, if you look at DSLR camera forums, compared to everyone else, you tend to say you will shoot images. Everyone else takes pictures.
Right. More
And
professional.
yeah, and that's why every Apple poster campaign says shot on iPhone.
Got it.
It
Got it.
doesn't say taken. And that partially because shot sort of represents a persona we all think we can probably aspire to. Everyone thinks they can be a great photographer with
Right.
a phone. So those are like two like really quite simple but powerful examples. And then I give you another one with say Diet Coke. They had like a year's worth of mentions of Diet Coke on social. And of course, they were doing the usual stuff like, well, give me a word cloud, and it would say Diet Coke, pizza, ice, party, whatever. And sort of, I guess, reassuring, but not particularly insightful. Um, the key thing we did there was that text data one of the metadata points was time. So you can split that data set into how people talked about Diet Coke before the ad campaign, how they talk about it after the ad campaign. And the difference is the effect the ad campaign had on how people perceive Diet Coke. And that is like a 10x more valuable outcome than from exactly the same data than what they were doing, which was a kind of, sentiment and
Right.
word
Right. Right. Right.
things like that.
Let's go back to, I just want to clarify a couple of things. You talked about search versus discovery. Uh, In search, I feel like you almost need to have a hypothesis that you're trying to validate and say, prove or disprove this hypothesis. Is that correct? From your perspective, when you use
Yes, yeah, I
search?
think I think that's true. And but I think both approaches are valid. I think with text in particular, it's quite easy to fall into the trap of confirmation bias. So um, if you go back to the Diet Coke one, for instance, okay, the fact that the Diet Coke was associated with pizza, ice, parties, sport. Okay, that's great. However, if you go off and do exactly the same data collection for Diet Pepsi, it looks almost exactly the same. It was like Diet Pepsi, ice, pizza, sport, party. In fact, you could say soft drink,
Yeah,
and
and it'll
it,
say
yeah.
similar. Yes.
So it's quite easy to be duped into thinking that just because you're associated with some language, that is a unique attribute for your brand or your service or product or whatever it might be. When actually it's not. So actually, one of the other things we did there was what you really want to do. Diet Coke doesn't really care how people talk about Diet Coke. I mean, they do, but what's more interesting is to understand what's the difference between how people talk about Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi. And then that gives you something to work with, something to either double down on or
Yep.
some issues to
Or
address.
rectify. Right.
Sure.
Exactly. Yeah. Makes sense. And this is different from sentiment analysis. I think a lot of social media listening um, kind of goes into using text for analytics, but it's really driven to understand sentiment. Um, this is different. This might bring sentiment into the forefront, but it also brings other language into it as well, other attributes.
Yeah, yeah, that's a key thing. So I think so. Sentiment is normally quite a broad metric, and it can be useful at maybe top level. Um, but when you get into maybe second level analytics, it kind of falls away. And so one of the key results of our approach is that the differences that we surface are always expressed as a metric, and this is key because what we're seeing and actually we're seeing more of this now with Chat GPT and other LLMs and AI coming up is that all of a sudden now everyone's really quite interested in text analytics because you can use Chat GPT. Um, the what we're seeing with our customers though is that all of a sudden senior stakeholders are now interested in text analytics because of Chat GPT. But on the whole, what people are doing is kind of doing summarization with ChatGPT, which can be very useful, but is not a metric. And right. And stakeholders, the way what they are normally interested in is a metric. It doesn't matter what the data source is. They like metrics because it's easier to understand. And crucially, it's easier to align companies and business
And
decisions around
teams,
the
right.
metric.
Yep.
You can't really align a company around a paragraph of unstructured text, which changes every week. So when we say, let's say, for example, we're doing customer experience analytics, and we know that this month there is we will say there's a 1.8 times more prevalence in terms of pricing and your service plans compared to the trailing 6 months. So obviously it's useful to know that um, that is an issue.
It's in the forefront.
Yeah. But
Yep.
being able to express that as a metric 1.8 times is incredibly useful when you're then, like most insight teams, have to communicate to a stakeholder, right? So communicating the 1.8 is actually the most valuable part out of that quite often.
So you mentioned that you have a lot of clients primarily in the United States. And I know one of your key missions is to get this type of measurement into the C-suite to be able to provide context for all this unstructured data and be able to, help companies make decisions. Where are you in that journey? Has it been adopted? Just give us kind of your perspective of where you are.
So, I mean, I can't talk about specific customers, but we have got several very well-known brands who use the analytics we provide in their CEO dashboards, which is great because, what I want is that when we ask senior people what your business intelligence source is, we want one of their top 10 to be, text-based open-end
Right.
text.
Yeah.
Um, so they are absolutely doing that. I think we're seeing a quite an interesting dynamic going on with AI coming out. Just, I mean, obviously, everyone's probably rolling their eyes, and I know it's another Chat GPT blog, but what's quite fascinating is how the everyone is going through their own personal Gartner hype cycle journey,
Yes, for
right?
sure.
And some are just at the beginning. And then someone have punched all the way through it and have concluded this stuff's great, but it's not on its own. It's not going to be good enough. What it has done, undoubtedly, has with the more sophisticated customers who are maybe a bit further down their journey, undoubtedly has put the potential of text analytics for making game-changing business decisions at the top of the corporate agenda. That has absolutely happened. And so the way that companies are assessing text analytics capability, it's no longer a feature they might have in some other tool, but they're starting to regard it as a strategic capability in their infrastructure, which is very exciting because that's normally the first indication in technology that this is now a thing, and people are really focusing on it.
And do you think that, well, let me ask you this. As you see the adoption of text into, let's say, the CEO dashboard for some of the clients that you work with, are there follow-on questions? Are you getting a ton of inquiry as the next step in terms of introducing these metrics that you guys provide? Like, I'm sh- I don't know anybody who looks at a metric and doesn't ask at least 5 other questions after that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's a good so I think that the way to think about it is, we sort of have this sort of pyramid. So at the top is like the North Star metric, and that's how everything's distilled down to the very senior stakeholders. But underneath the top of that pyramid, there's like the next level down, which might be actually there's maybe 5 metrics actually go into that
That
top.
support that North Star. Okay,
Correct, and then
got it.
it trickles on down. So what we do is that we enable our customers, who tend to be analysts and head of consumer insight, head of customer experience analytics, and so on, to represent the right metric to the right seniority. But if the detail is needed, it's all part of the build up to that top one. There's another aspect though, which is kind of related to this, which we're starting to see as well, which is again, it's sort of related to the AI boom, but there's no questions being asked around three key things. Like one is metrics, which we've talked about, and then the other is evidence, and then audit. These are becoming quite interesting. LLMs, or AI in the popular press at the moment, LLMs are a great tool and they're fantastic tech. Um, one of the There's a couple of drawbacks to them. One is that they are black boxes. Okay. So it gives you an answer, but you cannot verify why it gave you that answer. That's one problem. And the second is that they're prone to what's called a hallucination. So, fundamentally they are sort of predictive statistical models, and they'll predict what they think is statistically most likely. And sometimes that's not actually, they misconstrue things. So, what tends to happen then is that, okay, so senior stakeholders, they want, first of all, metrics, and we've talked about that. But below that, why do they want metrics? There's another one of the reasons is, if you're making a consequential business decision, um, you need the evidence of why that decision is being made. If analytics are part of that process, you need to be able to go back to the analytic workflow and be able to see the evidence for the
Defend it. Yeah.
yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
And if you rely completely on an LLM, you can't do that.
By itself, right?
Yes,
Yeah, without
that
the other tools that might leverage an LLM or ChatGPT, whatever,
and then augment it. Yeah,
and augment it. Yeah. No, and
yeah,
that makes perfect sense. This is the thing that I always wonder, like, there's so much technology and there's so much stuff that we leave that's behind the machine, if you will. And I just am fascinated by the fact that some people or companies, and maybe this is to the point of where people are in their journey in leveraging AI, that they're not, opening the black box and saying, wait a second, I can't just trust this, on faith, or I like the output. This makes sense. I'm going to use it. And I think we'll see more questioning
yeah. I,
evidence, right?
I think for sure. I mean, it does vary by use case, to be fair. I mean, I think there are use cases where you don't, as long as it gets you a good result, you don't really care how it got to it. Um, and I think we are starting to see questions asked of LLMs, and maybe there's definitely hesitation in the market. Um, and I think there's another facet to what you described, which is then going to be regulation. So if you're in a highly regulated industry, um, healthcare, financial services, for instance, um, the third thing after evidence is going to be audit. So the problem is that legislation is constantly trying to catch up with technology, especially in AI. And if you're in an industry where you're used to being audited and you're using LLMs in your decision making, then if your audit trail stops with "the computer told me to do it," you know that that that's not a great, and
That's not
not place.
defensible. Yeah,
Yeah. So
exactly.
one of the most interesting things we're doing at the moment is combining LLMs with the metrics that we provide, so that your sort of instant output is this sort of great summarization narrative, but with defensible metrics inserted into that. So that's looking really, really quite exciting, that kind of angle.
What are some of the objections that you get from clients or prospects, I'll say, when they look at your platform and not usability perspective, but like the 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 data that you provide, the metrics that you provide, what are some of the challenges that clients or prospects give you?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to do is kind of to get customers to think about their data in a slightly different way than they're used to thinking about it. Um, so I'll give you an example. So probably the most common data source we assess is surveys, actually, open-end surveys. Um, and people are used to sort of analyzing surveys, certainly from a text point of view, in a quite sort of vanilla fashion. Um, but what we have to sort of educate people with is you have your from our point of view, the text data, the primary data source. But then you might have the age range of the respondent, the income range of the respondent, geography, what service they've got, what product they've got, all kinds of different things. So the first step, I wouldn't say it's an objection, but the first step is more of an awakening of, you don't just have to look at this text as one block. What you can do with this is all of a sudden you can say, well, wait a minute, how do people of this age range respond to my survey compared to other age ranges? What's different with what these people are concerned with? How much more are they talking about one aspect or another? Same thing for, say, income group might have different aspects. The people in different geographies might have different areas of concern, and so on and so on. So you can go from this quite flat data structure into this kind of multi-dimensional thing. So that normally it's just inspiring people to like find out what's the most important thing to you, because you can go and create it. And so once people have sort of opened their minds up with that, we can really help them drive on. And then I think in analytics, there's always a sort of the manual point. So one of the things we are doing is quite often once people figure out what's important to them, they want to do the same analysis flow all the time. So now we've started introducing functions in the tool which will automate that. So you can just basically program it to like automatically get the data, automatically do the analysis flow. And so you come in Monday morning, switch on relative insight, and you've got the answer.
That's fantastic, right?
Yeah, no, that's
That's
pretty.
the dream.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, especially in the existing environment where budgets are tight, teams are tight, speed of insight is kind of everything at the
It's
moment.
huge. It's
Yeah.
huge. Yeah, and I think as I'm still fascinated by the statistic that 90% of products fail, right? And so that speed to insight's critical, but I'm on this journey to figure out, why is it still 90%? If there's this research and tools like yours and other platforms where you can essentially, stage gate your innovation every step of the way,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something I wrestle with. Like as a
right?
product company, that is,
Yeah.
that's it. Like the product's everything. I think there's a few myths, I think, in tech and SaaS in particular, that um I think first off, it's incredibly tempting as a vendor to believe your own hype and think that, it's a great idea because it's your idea. Therefore, it should be so like what's obvious to you as a vendor, sometimes customers really don't care that much, or what you think is just a minor irritation in usability to the customer might be, it's just, I can't spend half an hour struggling with, so it's really important to be sort of quite humble, and try and talk to customers as much as possible. I think the other thing is, it's I think we see a lot of vendors go out and try and do pure SaaS with analytics, and that can shortchange customers. We do quite a lot of like managed service with customers. There's zero value to anyone, the vendor or the customer included, to just sort of buy the software, get trained,
And they see you later.
see you
Yeah.
later. We'll,
Yeah.
we'll see you at the next quarterly check
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
You've not done anything. No one's inspired you. No one's brought best practices. So there's a lot of pressure on vendors to sort of, to minimize that. But I think that is shortchanging yourself.
No, I think it's important because at the end of the day, we are, people who are bringing innovations, platforms such as yours. it's still change management. It's still helping clients manage through the change and understand the value of the data or the solutions that you bring to them.
Yeah, and I think that there's another aspect is that as technology becomes more mainstream, text analytics is actually quite a good example of this. In the early days, all of our customers were quite advanced users because you had to be kind of really into it in order to buy relative insight, 5 years ago. But as text analytics is becoming more of a mainstream capacity, actually what we need to do is sometimes not be at the cutting edge all the time,
Right.
because some customers, okay, that's nice, but I just want to do maybe quite basic, simple stuff for this use case. So actually, we've actually broadened what we do. So the journey isn't about getting smarter and smarter all the time. Sometimes it's about reining it in and being simpler.
Totally agree. Because you have those early adopters, but it's few and far between, right? It's that middle group that you really want to target and say, what's the right use case for you to get used to a new solution? And I don't need all the bells and whistles. It's just help me basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly right. Yeah, yeah,
And thank you so much for joining me today. Really enjoyed our conversation. And, I look forward to seeing where Relative Insights goes and, look forward to keeping in touch.
yeah. No, we're on a good journey. We're really excited about the future, and thanks very much for asking me on.
Thank you.